Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Australia has taken the lead. Great Britain is in second place, and Canada is coming along in third. Ghana has dropped way back to fourth place. Russia, Japan, Bulgaria, Uganda, and Italy have all taken to the field, but they're going to have to make up a lot of track. The big difference between a forest and woods is how thick the canopy is. The woods are a bit less dense, and just a bit of sunlight gets all the way down to the ground. The forest is thicker, and therefore the ground at the bottom tends to stay wet longer. A walk in the woods or forest can be relaxing. Most antidepressants are maybe 35% effective. That's why the doctors always tell you you'll also have to take this other drug and this other drug. And then the big pharma comes out and says, oh, by the way, taking this drug might lead to suicidal tendencies. That doesn't sound really good. A better living through chemical dependency. That's what we used to say back in the 60s. A walk in the woods has been determined to be 85 to 90% more effective on relieving depression. That is, as long as you don't get scared to death. Then again, if you're scared and shaking in your boots, you won't be depressed. I have a few listeners in Germany. I hope I pronounce these names correctly. I have a hard enough time with English. I ran into some more confusion when reading about Reinhardswald and Schwarzwald. Some said that the two forests were connected or that they were the same place, while others said they were two distinct locations. One is north of Frankfurt and the other is to the south. Are they connected? Perhaps the woods go around Frankfurt? I don't know. If you're in Germany or you've been to Germany and you know, let me know. I'm curious. In Germany, they have a wooded area known as the Reinhardswald. It sits about 300 miles north of the Black Forest, according to some. This area was once home to magic mirrors, of fairy godmothers, princesses, and goblins. A lot of the Grimm's fairy tales came from the Reinhardswald. Near there, according to German fairy tales, a beautiful princess fell asleep, locked inside the Sabesberg castle. She stayed asleep for 100 years before being awoken by her prince. I'll bet she had some rank morning breath. Rapunzel let down her long golden hair from a tower so her rescuer could climb up. I hope she had good roots. A couple of kids were abandoned deep in the forest by their folks because they couldn't afford to feed them. They stumbled upon a cottage made of gingerbread where a witch tried to eat them. The story of a frog trying to convince a princess to kiss him also came from the area. Snow White wound up cohabitating with 7 vertically challenged men. There was a young girl with a propensity to wear red outfits. She encountered a gender-confused wolf with a taste for young girls. Literally. Grimm's fairy tales were not intended for children. These were some frightening and sometimes nasty stories with social implications. In the story of Cinderella, the wicked stepsisters cut pieces of their own feet off, trying to get them into the golden slipper. The prince figured it out when he noticed that they were bleeding a lot from their shoes. In the end of the story, the two wicked stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by pigeons. Not the kind of thing you see in a Disney movie, huh? Having failed in their attempts to become lawyers, the two brothers settled down to try their hands at writing. Had they succeeded in their first business venture, none of the famous tales from the Reinhardswald area would be so well known today. Had Disney not changed the stories so much, a lot of kids would have grown up with a lot different outlook on life. The Grimm's brothers simply wrote down the stories that had been part of an oral folk tradition for generations. Whether a princess actually slept for 100 years, well, we don't know. Is that possible? What's important is the message behind the stories, as well as their setting. A dark and sinister wood home to all kinds of strange activities. As industrialization advanced, most wooded areas were cut down to build houses and ships. People living in towns and cities began to view forests as being dark, foreboding places filled with paranormal activity. As the stories from the Grimm brothers began to catch on, people began to view forests and the people living there with a more romantic slant. Suddenly, forestry workers became the career to pursue. Mothers would search out woodmen as future sons-in-laws. Women actively sought out woodsmen as husbands. Tree planting became quite popular, even way back then. In the 1930s, a particular Austrian with a mustache built on the ideas the German people were connected with the forest and the things that took place there. The myths and legends from the past became the history of this new administration. Folks visiting the forest today have reported feelings as if they're being watched. The place looks spooky. On occasion, they'll see a dark shadow stepping from behind a tree or vanishing into a thick, brushy area. There should be all manner of paranormal activity, and so people have felt and seen things that are unexplainable. I searched and I searched, but I couldn't find any actual stories of paranormal activity or sightings in the wooded area. Which is odd because there are lots of people that say people see ghosts there, people see witches, people see all kinds of strange creatures, but none of the stories had any substance. It was just somebody saw a ghost, somebody saw a witch. But there was nothing much to the stories, so unfortunately I don't have much else to tell. Throughout history, there appear to be relatively consistent reports of humanoid entities that appear to be on fire or are able to become human torches at will. Somehow these people are able to burst into flames without suffering any adverse side effects. In the past, these folks were called burning men or flaming phantoms. Seen in or around the Black Forest of Germany. In 1125, there was the railback burning man. Witnesses, including one George Mitzenberger, reported seeing a bizarre entity described as resembling a burning man or a man made of fire. This creature was seen running through the woods over some hills, and he was spitting out fire from his mouth. There were a number of other witnesses, but none of their names were mentioned in the reports I read. Some said that they could plainly see the man's ribs through his flaming chest. It reportedly remained wandering around the mountainous area for some time. Lots of people would encounter this flaming human, and of course, the natural reaction would be to scream and turn and run. In the Schwarzwald, also known as the Black Forest, the flaming humanoid was seen flying around a village before coming to rest on the church steeple. In a panic, at the sight of what appeared to be a demonic attack on their church, the townsfolk amassed at the base of the church and began throwing rocks up at this creature. It hung from the steeple for some time before it simply leaped into the air and flew away. The entire town had seen this thing. Now, could they all have been imagining things? Or perhaps, as the skeptical folks would say, they're all lying, trying to get people to come to their village. Yeah, that's a good way to attract people. We have a burning demon in our town. Come visit. In a story that could be related, we go to England. One autumn evening in 1965, a group of British youths were cruising around Felixstowe, a port town northeast of London. At around 10:30 p.m., Saturday 20th, three young folks were just driving around with not much else to do. The driver pulled over to the side of the road and he stopped. They continued talking when suddenly the driver opened the door and stepped out. He walked away into the woods. The other two figured, well, it must be the call of nature. And you know, when nature calls, you must answer. The driver had pulled to the side of the road in a wooded area, just away from town. The two still in the car heard a loud humming sound. They looked out the windows and then they looked up and they saw what looked like a huge orange oval that appeared to have flames coming off of it. This thing was about 90 feet up in the air above the car. There was light coming off of this flying vehicle and it was lighting up the ground around them. The humming object suddenly turned and began flying away. It was heading in the same direction as the driver had walked just a few minutes ago. The two in the car, well, they were a little worried about their friend, and so they started yelling his name, telling him to come back to the car. Quickly. Suddenly, the driver did emerge from the woods. He staggered towards the edge of the road. He looked as if he was in a stupor. Once he was at the side of the road, he simply stopped and kind of stood there swaying a bit, and then he fell to the ground. The two in the car jumped out, ran to him. He was unconscious. They grabbed him, drug him back to the car, threw him into the back seat, and they sped away. They decided they'd best get their friend to the hospital. Once there, the nurses began to work on him. They discovered he had some odd burns on his neck and along his back. He also had a contusion to the side of his head just below one eye. When he finally came to, he didn't recognize his two friends. He had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there. The doctor decided we'd best ship this guy off to a bigger hospital, and so they sent him to Ipswich. The following day, the driver did recover his senses. When his friends came to visit, he told them what had happened the night before. He said he had no idea why he got out of the vehicle. He said it felt as if he was being pulled by some unseen force. Once he was away from the others, he ran into some kind of a weird-looking alien. This being was human-looking, but he looked as if he was made up of fire. The driver passed out immediately after seeing this creature, and he had no recollection of what happened until he awoke in the hospital in Ipswich. The two friends related seeing the flaming UFO that had flown in the same direction that the driver had just walked in. The question they all asked was, did the flaming creature come from the UFO? Or was it some unrelated creature that just happened coincidentally? A demon suddenly appearing at the same time as a UFO. The driver still has the scars on his body today to help him remember what happened. Back to the Schwarzwald, there have also been reports of werewolves, witches, and demons seen in the forest. Der Grossman is also linked to the Black Forest. This is a tall, horribly disfigured man with bulging eyes, and he has more than just 2 arms. They never say how many he has, just that he has more than 2. He likes to compel children to walk off into the forest. Once they do, they're never seen again. Some folks say that the Slender Man was created by somebody on creepypasta. He sounds an awful lot like the Grossman from Germany, which is hundreds of years old. Just because somebody gives some paranormal creature a name doesn't mean they invented him. Most folks think that Mary Shelley came up with the idea for Frankenstein after having a dream. Johann Conrad Dippel was born in Castle Frankenstein in 1673. He was trying to invent some kind of a potion that would extend your life, if not make you live forever. He also tried to bring a dead body back to life. In one of his experiments, Dippel blew himself along with the castle tower into orbit. Shelley wrote down what she had heard while touring Germany, and then she wrote her world-famous book. Der Grossman legend has been around since medieval times in the 16th through the 18th century. He was also known as the Tall Man, the Big Man, the Giant Man, and a lot of other names. Does this kind of remind you of the Slender Man and the Hat Man? The legend states that Der Grossman is a fairy who lives in the Black Forest. Parents would tell their children not to go into the woods late at night or to stay awake all night while laying in bed. I don't know what they would have been doing, reading comic books by Flash? No, you can't do that back then. They didn't have comic books yet. What did little kids do late at night when they're supposed to be in bed? Well, maybe we don't want to know. Anyway, Der Grossman would come late at night. He would stand just outside the window, looking in at them. If they were awake when they should be asleep, he would entice them to come outside and follow him into the woods. If, on the other hand, they didn't follow his instructions, sometimes he would creep in through a window, snatch them out of their beds, and haul them away into the night. They would never be seen again. Any children that went into the forest on their own, despite their warnings, would find themselves being chased deeper and deeper into the forest until they could no longer find their way home. Should the child somehow manage to escape and return home, he or she was compelled to confess what they had done to their parents, along with any other misdeeds they may have done, or Der Grossman would come back the following night and repeat the experience of the night before. Maybe this time they wouldn't be so lucky as to find their way home. Der Grossman could be just a character invented by parents to keep kids in line, but there are so many stories about this creature from all over the area, and a lot of legends are based on actual occurrences. To the west of the Black Forest is an area known for a werewolf sighting. The legend of the Moorbach monster begins with a soldier named Thomas Johannes Baptist Schweitzer. He served in the the Napoleonic Grand Army during the failed attempt to conquer Russia. Schweitzer was there when the Russians abandoned Moscow in 1812, and they set fire to the city, ultimately destroying 3/4 of the town. Napoleon's army was there in the wintertime. No food, no shelter. Not a good time to be in Russia. Sensing defeat was coming soon, and fearing for his own life, Schweitzer decided it was time to head back home. So he deserted and headed home. Along with Schweitzer, there was a group of Russian deserters who decided they wanted to go to France as well, or Germany. They had nothing to return to, and if they were caught, they would be shot as deserters. They stood a much better chance of surviving in France than returning to their homeland. It's roughly 160 miles north to Alsace when the group came upon a rural German village in Wittlich. Needing food and supplies, they raided the farm, and in the process they wound up murdering the family that lived there. As the farmer's wife lay dying, she placed a curse on Schweitzer. As she said, "From now on, at each full moon, you will change into a rabid wolf." Schweitzer proceeded to kill her because he wasn't happy being cursed. Slowly, Schweitzer began to change. The extent of his depravity became so bad that the Russians decided they didn't want anything to do with him. So, Schweitzer wound up moving on and wound up with a group of highwaymen. After the highwaymen discovered how bad this guy could be, they decided they didn't want anything to do with him either. So, he pretty much abandoned civilization and went off to live in the woods by himself. Shortly after his self-exile, tales of a wolf that walked on 2 legs like a man began to circulate through the area. Killings began. A mysterious wolf-like creature would attack villages, it would attack farms out in the woods, it would attack travelers at night, and it would carry off livestock, was circulating. Schweitzer was soon suspected of being behind these murders. There was no evidence to point in his direction, but you've got some insane guy living out in the woods all alone that everybody says has no limits. His name is going to be attached to the murders. One night, Schweitzer attacked a young woman named Elizabeth Burrell and did bad things to her. Days later, when the villagers found out what had happened to Elizabeth, they decided they'd had enough, and they descended on Schweitzer's camp. It was time to do away with this menace. Schweitzer managed to escape, and they pursued him to the village of Moorbach, which was about 40 miles southeast of Mittloch. He must have had a horse. Taking the curse seriously, once the villagers had killed Schweitzer, they buried his body, and then they built a shrine on top of it. In the shrine, they placed a sacred candle that was to be lit at each sundown to keep the werewolf in the grave. A legend said that as long as the candle is kept burning, the creature will be bound to the grave. 9 months after Schweitzer had been killed, Burrell gave birth to a son. There's no report of the son being extremely hairy or having a propensity to kill anybody in the village, so apparently the curse ended with the father. He has descendants living in the area today. Schweitzer's story did not end with his death. One summer night, 1988, there was a group of U.S. Air Force personnel that were returning to Moorbach U.S. Air Force Base. One of them noticed that the candle was not lit. Either it had gone out or the person in charge had forgotten. This got all the U.S. personnel to laughing about the superstitious villagers and their nonsense. Only those people would believe in a werewolf. Late that night, the security sirens began to blast. Someone had gotten into the base. The perimeter sensors were all showing that there had been a breach. One of the guards began patrolling the perimeter fence, and he saw a wolf-like creature standing on 2 legs. When it saw him looking at it, this creature turned and ran for the fence. It leaped over an 8-foot-high fence with barbed wire at the top in a single bound. The base personnel all gathered at the site where the creature had escaped, and they brought a tracking dog with them. The dog took one sniff of the scent and tried to return to its barracks. He was not having any of that action. Once the sun came up, all the fears were put to bed. People just saw shadows. People's imagination was just getting the better of them. They all had a good laugh about it and pretty much hoped that nothing bad would happen the following night. That evening, right around sundown, one of the senior NCOs was seen slipping out the gate, heading over to the shrine and checking to make sure that that candle was lit. Just southwest of Escondido in California is the Elfin Forest. The name brings up thoughts of small creatures with pointy ears. In actuality, a dentist had bought the place, and all of his friends used to call it the Toothy Acres. Well, the family didn't much like that name, so they changed it to the Elfin Forest, which is from a book by Francis Marion Futz. The Elfin Forest of California, which was written in 1923. People have said that there's a witch that haunts this wooded area. The story began many years ago. A family was visiting the town, and the 3 of them took a walk out in the woods. They were exploring and just enjoying the day. And nobody saw the family return. They didn't know what happened to them, and most people began suspecting they had simply had enough and moved on. Nobody saw the family. Nobody knew where their possessions might have gotten to. Several days went by before a bedraggled woman came stumbling back into town. It took a while for them to recognize her as one of the missing family. The residents of the town cared for her until she recovered. She said that her husband and son had been murdered. A gang of wild men sprang out of nowhere and attacked. She was able to flee the scene, but everyone she cared for had been murdered. Over time, the dread look in her eyes began to fade. It was replaced with savage, cold fury. The woman seemed to transform into a new person. She spent her nights reading books that nobody could understand, as she would meet with strange folks from the local native tribes. Eventually, she stated, she was ready. She dressed in all white, walked out into the woods, and was never seen again. And nobody knows what she was ready for, but they kind of had a suspicion that she was seeking revenge. They all thought it'd be a good idea to stay out of the woods for a while. The story began to spread, as she was looking for the men who had murdered her family, and anybody that got in her way would probably wind up tasting her wrath as well. Hikers and campers in the elfin forest began reporting sightings of a ghostly form of a woman that would come drifting across the countryside. She moved as if her feet were not touching the ground. Sometimes she would go by at an incredible speed, while at other times she would just drift aimlessly along. Anyone attempting to communicate with her would see her simply vanish into nothing. After seeing this woman in white, everybody that was camping in the woods or hiking in the area would immediately pack up and leave. They all said that suddenly it didn't feel so good being in the woods. They said it felt evil. It sounds to me as if this woman had somehow purposefully turned herself into a spirit, as some kind of avenging creature that was out for justice. According to the mystics of Harmony Grove, the White Lady had finally managed to seek her revenge, and the sightings began to drop off. Harmony Grove is home to a group of psychics and occult practitioners that live and practice their abilities in the woods. They are open to visitors, and they'll tell folks about some of the paranormal things going on in the area. They sell trinkets, and they read palms or tarot cards to make ends meet. According to rumors, they were once involved in considerably more sinister activity than simple spiritism and fortune reading. At one time, Harmony Grove was occupied by gypsies. They somehow reanimated the spirits of hundreds of dead Indians, Feather, not Dot, who had been buried in the area. Nobody said whether these Indians had died of natural causes or had been murdered. At one time, getting back on myself, and not knowing who these spirits were, the folks living in town began to worry. Suddenly they would see these Indians walking through town in the middle of the night. They became afraid. Somehow the story got connected back to the gypsies in the woods, and a posse was formed. The townsfolk closed on the gypsy camp. Many of the people there were killed, while the others were driven off, minus all of their personal possessions. All their wagons, all of their clothes, everything was left behind. Only the bodies escaped. One female with incredible powers placed a curse on the land, and then she stood her ground to be killed by the villagers. From that day on, people report seeing this woman dressed all in black, riding a huge black horse, terrorizing the town and the woods around it. They say she has the ability to kill simply by looking at someone. If you do see her, but you manage to escape, the townspeople will tell you, do not come back. You have been marked. Anyone who sees the woman in black and survives to tell about it must leave and never return, because if they do come back, they will immediately die. Deering Woods is said to be the most haunted place in England. Nah, we're going to have to go through this again. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of places said to be the most haunted place. Insert name here. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. From now on, we should use the star system, just like hotels, motels, restaurants. Let's say a 1-star haunting, you might see Casper the Friendly Ghost. It's a family-friendly place. You don't have to worry about losing your life or sleep. A five-star haunting means that even your grandmother is going to be scared out of her socks, and she didn't come with you to visit. Deering Woods is haunted at, let's call it a 3 or 4-star ability. The Phantom Highwayman is a common sighting. He is supposed to be the spirit of a long-dead robber who preyed on travelers passing through the woods in the 18th century. The story goes he was either set upon by some of his own kind who wanted the gold he had acquired, or he was tracked down by the constabulary who pinned him to a tree with a sword. According to legend, the ghost appears to reenact his final minutes on Earth. Well, his living time on Earth. Maltman's Hill is haunted by the spirit of a horse-drawn coach. The ghosts have been seen and heard at various places around the village. An old couple were driving home after babysitting their granddaughter, sometime after midnight. At Pinnock's Crossroad, they could see a coach being pulled by horses. It was all lit up from inside. And nothing bad happened, just a spooky old coach went clattering by, pulled by a bunch of horses, in the middle of the night, in a town that doesn't have that sort of thing. It was a bit frightening, and it gave them something to talk about during their next visit. Oh yeah, last week we saw a ghost carriage. Nothing weird there. On another occasion, a local resident driving the back roads to get home had the coach pass right in front of him. It came out of a wall of trees. It crossed the road and then it vanished on the other side into more trees. There was no place for a coach to have been driven. November 1997 at about 7 p.m., a person driving through Pluckley heard the sound of horses' hooves on a cobblestone street. The road had been blacktopped for the last several decades. At one time, long ago, it had been cobblestones. So that's what he was hearing. Watercress or yellowcress is a species of aquatic flowering plant that is in the cabbage family. It is a rapidly growing perennial plant native to Europe and Asia. It is one of the oldest known leafy vegetables that has been consumed by humans. An old gypsy woman, or just an old woman, used to sit at the foot of the Crossroads Bridge, or it might have been the Pinnock Bridge, as she would sit there smoking a pipe and selling watercress. As she was a fixture known to all who lived in the area. If you wanted watercress and you didn't want to have to go swimming, you would go and buy it from her. One day she died in a fire. Nobody knows if this was some kind of an accident or if somebody had had it in for her. Some say she accidentally ignited a glass of booze that she was drinking with her pipe. Others say she was robbed and the fire was set to disguise the crime. People approaching the bridge today will see what looks like a misty figure sitting by the bridge. As they get closer, it takes on the shape of an old woman smoking a pipe. The ghost of a miller is often seen in the area, but he appears as a black figure. This spirit is seen near an old abandoned windmill. The last known miller to work the mill was Richard Dickey Buss, who closed the mill in 1930. The building was hit by lightning and it burned in 1939. Seeing a ghost haunting an old mill leads folks to believe that this must be the miller. It could be just any kind of an old spirit. Being all black makes me wonder just what are people seeing. The ghost is often seen as a thunderstorm is approaching the area. Days after World War I, a schoolmaster was supposed to have committed suicide by hanging himself from a tree on Dickey Bus Lane. The street was named after the miller. This sounds like a Pink Floyd song to me. Richard Buss found the body several days after the man had been reported missing from Smarden. The tree is no longer there, yet the body hanging from a tree limb is seen right next to the road on many occasions. They also see the ghost of a colonel who also hung himself in Park Wood, but now they see him walking amongst the trees. Many of the trees have been cut down and cleared, and the area is used as grazing land. Yet, late at night, trees reappear, and then they see this dark image walking amongst them. Someone was able to make out the uniform, and they associated the ghost with the story of the suicide. Clay Pit, an accident occurred at the old brickworks of the clay pit that created another of Pluckley's ghosts. A man was killed when either a wall of clay collapsed on him or he fell into the clay pit, depending on which version of the story you have. Late at night, people hear screaming coming from under the ground. Lady Deering, who lived in the 1100s, haunts the grounds of the Church of St. Nicholas. She was buried in a lead coffin that was placed inside an oak coffin and deposited in the church crypt. Nobody knows why she was buried inside two coffins. It wasn't uncommon to bury people in lead coffins because lead doesn't rot, and they thought, well, it will help keep the body in one shape. The name people give her is the Red Lady, which may come from a rose that was supposedly placed between her hands before the coffin was nailed shut. She is said to wander the churchyard in search of the unmarked grave where her stillborn child was buried. The lady and the child have never actually been traced back in history or identified. We also have the White Lady of St. Nicholas Church. Some say this is another member of the same family, so she would also be a Lady Deering. The White Lady is seen inside the church walking around as if she's looking for something. Before appearing at the church, the White Lady was seen at the Surrenden Manor. In the 1920s, the manor was used as a U.S. embassy. The people working there reported seeing a white-clad spirit in just about every part of the building. Walter Winnan held a vigil one Christmas Eve in the library. He sat there with his hunting rifle. When the White Lady appeared, he aimed and fired. The shot passed right through her, doing absolutely nothing. And then the ghost vanished. They believe that there is a secret panel in the library that leads down to a tunnel that passes under the ground to the local church. In the 1940s, the manor was turned into a boys' school, and in 1952 it caught fire and burned. Shortly after the manor was destroyed, the White Lady moved from the manor to the church. Rose Court is another haunted Pluckley house which dates back over 250 years. This ghost is again the result of a suicide, this time committed by eating poisonous berries. The lady, possibly a mistress of the member of the Daring family, can be heard calling to her dogs. She is also said to haunt both the house and the garden between 4 and 5 p.m., which is when she is supposed to have died. This is also the time that the dogs in the nearby hunting kennels were fed, and when the kennels were moved, the ghost and the dogs were no longer heard from. The Deering Arms was once an old hunting lodge, which is said to be haunted by an old lady in a bonnet. This apparition is said to be seen so clear that people think she's a guest until she vanishes. The Blacksmith's Arm is a pub which began life as a blacksmith shop. It is haunted by a cavalier, that's a cavalryman, who had died upstairs in one of the rooms. Nobody knows why he died, just simply that his body was found upstairs. Epping Forest in Essex has a rich history dating back to the Iron Age. There are stories of Roman battles taking place there, Norman invaders, and there was a notorious highwayman in the area. This guy was named Dick Turpin, who used to use a cave in the high beach area of Epping as his hideout for years. Due to the forest's proximity to London, it is also known as a burial site for murder victims, which many of the crazed victims believed to have been taken there. In the 1950s and 60s, Reginald and Ronald Cray were notorious criminals whose obsession with assaulting others encouraged each other to greater levels of violence. They extended their personal power and domination, culminating in a serious protection racket in London and a number of murders. They made a movie about them, the Cray Twins. Their blatant violence and unstable mental condition, particularly of Ronald Cray, led to the intimidation of witnesses and the prospect of their escaping justice, until they were finally arrested and convicted through the efforts of a special squad of detectives led by Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed. Countless paranormal reports over the years lead many to believe that this is the UK's most haunted forest. Let's give it a 3-star. The haunted history of Epping Forest is notorious, so much so that the TV Most Haunted carried out a live show there in 2003. They were hoping to contact the ghost of Dick Turpin. Well, they think that they may have gotten a hold of him. In the live broadcast, Turpin's spirit apparently presents itself to Yvette Fielding and then led her and her crew off the path and into the deep woods. Eventually, they had to call for a forestryman to come rescue them. They had no idea where they were. They had originally been filming at Lawton Camp, which is an area of the forest that Turpin had used as part of his hideout. Way back when the Ghost Hunters, the TV show, was first on, Jason Hawes and Grant Wilson also did a podcast, and I used to listen to that sucker every week. I also had the magazine, which I can't find any copies of anymore. That's what happens when you move. You lose things. Anyway, one night they had Yvette Fielding on the show. Somebody said something, and a bit of an argument ensued. Then things were said that probably shouldn't have been said. As she left the show before the thing was over. She just didn't want to talk to them anymore. It kind of reminded me of the good old days back when Art Bell used to hang up on people on his show. If you upset Mr. Bell, he would just push the button and end that show, and he'd start talking about something else. He didn't need you on his show. Anyway, yeah, that was a memorable podcast. Due to its reputation as one of the most haunted, like I said, 3, maybe 3.5 stars, forest in England, ghost hunts are regular throughout the year. As well as the ghost of Turpin, there are numerous other sightings and experiences that have occurred in Epping throughout the years. The ghost of Boudica, the queen of the British Iceni tribe, who was back in the 60s, not the 1960s, the 60s, is believed to haunt the forest. Why did the most haunted folks not try to contact her? Could there be a language issue? Which brings to mind a question. Once a person dies, if they come back as a ghost or a spirit, do you have to communicate them in their home language, or do they suddenly understand all languages? I've heard people say both. Some people will swear that once you're dead, you have all the answers, whereas other people will swear you don't have any of the answers. We don't know. Until a ghost actually comes in and sits down on the other side of my desk and agrees to an interview. That would be strange, wouldn't it? Anyway, until a ghost agrees to an interview, I'm not going to say one way or another. So, we don't know. Getting back to Boudica, why didn't the most haunted folks try to contact her? Like I said, could there be a language issue? We don't know. There's been poltergeist activity as in the area on a regular basis, and people report being pushed or touched by ice-cold hands when they're all alone. The site, which is just outside of Lawton, is thought to have been used as an army base by the Queen, and this has led to a number of people thinking that spirits and memories of dead soldiers have been left in the area. Apparitions have been seen all over the place. On one occasion, a man was spotted wearing a tricorn hat and a cape sitting on a black horse. The tricorn hat's that old thing they used to wear in the 1700s. If you ever seen a tricorn hat when it's out of shape, it's just a big round blob of a brim. But when you pin the three sides up, it takes on three corners. Tricorn, three-corner. For those of you that don't watch a lot of History Channel. At the Wake Arms roundabout, a headless apparition of a biker and a horse-drawn coach have been seen in the dead of night. Nobody knows the story behind the motorcyclist, just some biker without a head. Kind of like that Coal Shack TV show. The troubled spirit is said to run out in front of vehicles, stare directly into the driver's eyes, and then disappear just before the car hits him. The ghost of a young girl who reportedly drowned near the King Oaks pub has also been seen, and a headless horseman. So they've got two headless spirits hanging out in the area. I wonder if they ever get together and compare notes. Where'd you lose your head? Well, at Hangman's Hill, they have a strange appearance of a man wandering around in the area. They hear screams coming from the dark, and if you leave your car in neutral on the hill, it will roll upwards towards the tree where people were hung. Ghostly apparitions, spooky sounds, and bizarre phenomena seem to defy the laws of science are all a part of the paranormal legacy of the wild corners of Epping Forest. Alan Smith, a member of the paranormal investigation group Parahauntings UK, said there is a possibility that certain emotions can linger. He said the stone tape theory suggests that emotions and energy imprints itself on the surroundings in a magnetic way, much like a cassette tape will do. For the younger generation that don't know what a cassette tape is, before there were CDs, which came along before there were MP3s and MP4s, and I don't know what they have out today, before you had a CD player, you had a cassette player. And it was this long, skinny piece of magnetic tape that you had to have a number 2 pencil in your pocket so you could rewind the tape on occasion when it would get messed up. And of course, magnetic tape, it would scrape off the inside of the heads, so you had to clean the thing like every other day. That was magnetic tape. That's what a cassette tape was. The camp would be an area of very high emotion. Being a wartime camp, there would be emotions of going to war and being worried about not coming back. You never know what you could find when you go down there. This is all according to Alan Smith. A number of accounts have reported muffled sounds of drums and marching emanating from the forest, and some people believe that this is caused by the spirits of dead soldiers. They don't know if these are Roman or if they are Boudica's troops. Several reports have been made over the years of spirits apparently taking material form. In the 1960s, there were sightings of ghostly figures emerging from the pond near Lindsay Street in Epping. The figures were said to emerge from the pond on horseback before riding towards town and disappearing. Another pond that is at an unknown location for good reasons is supposed to be where people go to commit suicide. It all started with two young lovers who died in a tragic murder-suicide 300 years ago. And since this time, this pond attracts other people that want to do away with themselves. Grapeland, Texas isn't exactly in the woods, but there are a lot of trees around it. It's north of Huntsville and south of Tyler. Parker Cemetery has long since been the most talked about haunted place in Grapeland. Now, I can go with that. It is the most haunted place in the town. They're specific at being haunted to just one place. The historical cemetery is nestled beneath pines and giant cedars. It's in the bend of a deep sandy road where only a few rays of sunshine can peer through in the evening. There are many 100-year-old tombstones scattered about the place. Some are directly next to trees that have pushed through the gravesite over the years, while others are broken and laying where they fell. That's the problem with old cemeteries. They just fall apart, and there's no money to fix them up. Others are discolored by green fungus that is attempting to overtake the headstones. Many are so eroded over the time that you can't even read the names on them. An old church sits among the 100-year-old tombstones. The church, which is no longer in use, once held the services for the deceased. Over the years, hundreds have fled from the cemetery, with unexplainable events going on. Locals say they have witnessed strange lights floating about the cemetery at night. They hear piano music coming from the church. Something in the cemetery has been known to throw rocks at cars. Recent cemetery visitors reported these strange lights lingering around the cemetery. The guests said that at first they thought it was somebody walking around through the tombstones with a flashlight. It was about 50 yards away. But as the light got closer, it got brighter and brighter. Soon it looked more like a train was coming through the cemetery. These two visitors decided that this was not anything normal. Now, the thing is, they were supposed to be paranormal investigators, but they got scared and they ran for their car. They decided they didn't want to investigate anymore. They came to the conclusion that there was something in the cemetery that didn't want them there, and they did the smart thing and left. Others say that Hattie Parker, a woman buried in the cemetery, haunts the place. She has been prone to lose her patience with visitors, and she's the one that apparently throws rocks at people. In the early 80s, a group of teens went to the cemetery. They were supposed to pick somebody up that was there, some friend of theirs that had gone to the cemetery, and they were supposed to drive over and pick them up. They arrived at the cemetery, but they couldn't find anyone there. Well, being a bunch of teenagers, they started joking and messing around with each other, talking about the ghost of Hattie and whether or not she would appear to them or not. Finally, they got back in their vehicle to head home, and something knocked the back window out of the truck. They all jumped out. They looked around, thinking that somebody was pranking them, but there was nobody there. More rocks came flying through the air, and so they decided they'd best get out of there. They drove back home, and then they tried to figure out how they're going to explain this to their parents. They searched the entire truck, but they never found any rocks or any fragments of any rocks. Something had blown out the back window. The vehicle was looked over from one end to the other, and they could find no reason for the window to have been broken. Others who have experienced the haunting of Parker Cemetery don't claim that it's Hattie that is the problem, but they say it's some woman in a white dress who was the victim of a brutal murder. Ghost hunters in more recent years say that the woman was tortured and murdered before being buried in the cemetery, and she's the one haunting the place. Why she's throwing rocks, nobody knows. A former resident who went to the area decided to go to the cemetery with their camera. They caught something on their photos. They caught something that a lot of people in town are talking about. Oh, you've got to see those pictures from the cemetery, but unfortunately I couldn't find any copies of them anywhere. I searched and I searched and I finally gave up. If you do happen to have a copy of the photographs of whatever phantoms were caught in the cemetery, send me a copy so I'll at least know that this is correct. Send them to strangethings@arkanasa.com, and I'll put you in my next book. This reminds me of the photograph of the 4 ghosts that somebody caught at Fort McIntosh. People used to talk about these photos all the time. Border Patrol agents. They would say, yes, so-and-so got this photograph of 4 ghosts in front of one of the 2-story houses. And they would talk about it, but nobody knew anybody that had a copy of the photo. I was writing the book, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, and I wanted a copy of that photo to put in the book. Couldn't find it. I even talked to the police at the campus. They said they had a copy, but they couldn't find it. It was somewhere in the office. I know that feeling quite well. I've got a lot of things somewhere here in my office. Finally, I gave up. I decided I just won't use that particular photograph. I'll just mention it in the book. I was talking to Ishmael, the head of the LPRS, and he said, oh yeah, I've got that photo at home on my computer, and he sent it to me like 10 minutes later. Amazing. It is a photograph of 4 ghostly images out on the front porch of a house, but I don't know about the photographs from the cemetery. There's a cemetery found in a wooded area. Just the image brings to mind the thought of ghosts. If you've never been to an old abandoned cemetery out in the woods in the middle of the night, I highly recommend it if you don't like sleeping at night. Bastrop State Park is known for being surrounded by the Lost Pine Woods, which are estimated to date back to the Pleistocene era. Only a few years ago, the park suffered a flood and a forest fire. Bad news, the place was pretty beat up. My wife and I visited the park shortly after the flood and fire. The trails were kind of beat up, but still, you walked down one of the trails and it only took a couple of minutes before you felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. Which is kind of interesting because Bastrop Park is right next door to the town. You can see the highway from the RV sites, and you've always got your Wi-Fi connection to your phone. The park was built back in the 1938. Over the years, thousands of people have visited it and walked the trails. Some have come away with some really bizarre stories. A group of campers had checked into the park, and they were going to stay for a week. They're going to hike the trails and check out the sights. The first couple of days, they did their exploring in the daytime, and nothing really bizarre happened. The third night, they decided to switch things up. They were going to go hiking the trails in the dark. As long as you stay on the trail, you can have quite an experience. You'll see animals that only come out at night, and it's a lot different than doing it in the day. Well, the group managed to get off the trail, and suddenly they found themselves in an untended part of the park. No trails to follow and no way to get back home. The wind began to blow. It got harder than seemed possible. It was whipping up dirt, and it was flinging leaves and debris in all directions. Sounds began to come from the dark. They said it sounded like large animals were fighting, tearing each other apart, screaming and howling, coming from all directions. Rain began to fall. Not just pleasant sprinkles, but a downpour. The ground turned to mud, and the hikers began to panic. They pushed ahead through the thick brush, trying to go towards what they hoped would be a main trail. If you've never gotten lost in the woods, in the dark, it can feel impossible to ever get back to your camp. With no moon, no stars to guide on, the group could only keep going and hope for the best. They managed to find a small trail that led to a bigger trail that eventually led them back to their campsite. As they walked along the trail, they began to notice the brush was dry. The dirt underfoot was dry as well. At getting back to camp, they saw no signs of the storm that they had just walked through. To add to their confusion, nobody's clothing was wet, not even damp. Each of them knew that they had just been through something unexplainable. With only questions, they packed up their things and got the heck out of there. Their week-long camping trip was cut in half. This last encounter I came across from a fisherman in France. He sent it into a fishing magazine, and here it is. During the late afternoons, I had the feeling of being watched from the woods at the far end of the lake, he said. Each day at the same time, the feeling would return, usually right around dusk, and from a different area, as if whatever it was getting closer. The angler camped near the chateau that was riddled with bullets from the Second World War. When he awoke the next morning, he got quite a shock. He said, "I decided to make a brew. I understand they drink a lot of coffee in France, and so I'm figuring he was going to make a pot of coffee. As I flicked on the lighter, the sparks silhouetted the face of a helmeted German soldier peering into my bivvy. That's a kind of a sleeping bag with a small tent attached. The German soldier was peering in from the darkness outside. The angler later discovered that the area around the woods had been a site of a fierce battle between the American and the German soldiers. The Germans fled into the woods, but they were ambushed by a second patrol. Their bodies were simply buried where they fell. So the area around that lake is a cemetery of sorts. Yep, a walk in the woods can be relaxing. It can lift you out of a depression. Or you might have an encounter that can't be explained. If you have any cool stories of your own, or you've heard from some friend or family member, send them to me and I'll put you in my next book. Send your stories to strangethings@arkanasa.com. If you'd like to get a t-shirt, not this one, I got this from the Mothman Museum, but if you'd like to get a t-shirt from Strange Things, go to tpublic.com, and if you'd like to get one of my books, amazon.com. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight. night in the hanging tree.